I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and welcome to night 4 of the 2024 Summer Mini Skein mini-series, where every night this week I will be dyeing different colorways sets of 5 mini skeins that are all intended to be worked together in one project, and we're going to explore different techniques and colors and have a lot of fun. Tonight we're moving away from some of the tonal sets we've played with already to transition to something that is more of a fade set, where we'll have variegated skeins where colors maybe come in and go out, so then you can work it together to create some kind of fade. And by fade I mean when you work these colors together, the transition from one color to the next won't be as stripy. It'll be more of a smooth transition because of the ways I'm planning out the colors. Tonight I plan to play around with dyeing this set all in one pan at first before dividing things up. And for our prototype, we're going to look at 4 different yarn bases. We have Platinum DK, that is 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon. That yak sock, which is 70% superwash merino, 20% yak, 10% nylon. Diamond sock, which is 80% superwash merino wool, 20% silk. And then Krypton, which is a fingering weight 75-25 superwash merino nylon stock yarn. I pre-soaked all of the yarn in some plain tap water with no acid, off camera, likely for a couple of hours, if not overnight. And so before we talk about the colors, let's go see how I plan to set up our pans. My plan today is to try to do a one pan set of colors. Now, there are times when I've arranged yarn sort of like this to do it, so you go from one end to the other. But today, I think I want to arrange the skeins the long way, and I'm going to twist them, because my hope is that if I twist them and make that a little bit loose, that I can access all 4 of the skeins a little bit more evenly. Because if I were going to just put them in like this, you could get a skein that gets partially covered up in the middle, and then also the separation between them isn't as obvious. So with it twisted, and the nice thing with having the yak in there is that we can get a sense of the coverage. We can get things spread out a little more. Now, I will likely twist and retwist things multiple times, but I'm not twisting particularly tight, and we'll still be working the color through. So I'm going to twist these last 2 skeins, and then we can add some water. And since I will be using dry dye powders, we'll talk about the colors in a moment. I do want to have some yarn mops pre-soaked, so I added a couple tablespoons of white vinegar to our previous pre-soak container, and then added in a skein of Knit Pick Stroll fingering weight yarn and a skein of Knit Pick Swish DK. Swish is 100% superwash merino, and Stroll is 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon. So far this series, we've played around with a lot of measurement-based things, trying to plan colorways or fades, and really relying on some math, whether it is 1 tablet, 2 tablets, or we're looking at the grams of dye per grams of yarn more specifically. Tonight, things are going to be a little bit more free-flowing because I plan to add dye directly onto the powder without measuring out first. Although you could pre-measure the dye so that way you use the same amount of each color on each batch, but I think that for this type of technique it's a little bit better to sort of go by feel, so that way you don't run out and then have something that doesn't have the colors, and yeah. But while we didn't do calculation specifically, I did do some color planning. I played around in paint and using, on Dharma's website with their acid dyes, you can kind of pull swatches of the different colors, and I pulled together colors I wanted to incorporate together, and then played around with how I might want to incorporate them into a 5 skein colorway. Part of me really wishes that I had screen recorded this process as I played around with the colors, erased things, added things. It was a lot of fun, and so maybe next time I'll have to screen record that. But let's go talk more about the colors and my plan. The color palette that I plan to play around with today is Sand Dune, Vanilla Cream, Honey Mustard, Peach Blush, Flamingo Pink, and Oxblood Red. These are all Dharma acid dyes. And I plan on applying them as straight dye powder. Maybe we'll end up doing some colors as speckles. We'll sort of see how they behave on the yarn itself. But not every color will be applied to the entire pan. We'll be having some back and forth. And some of the colors might move from, if something was just supposed to be on skeins, say 3 through 5, a little bit might move on to 4. That's okay. This is just sort of a general guide to help me plan where I plan to put the colors. Let's add some water. We only have 400 grams of yarn in here, but because they're in minis, that's how we've been able to fill the pan out so much. If they were full skeins and I twisted them, often we would end up with more gaps in the middle. That was 8 cups of water, and I'm gonna add, I think, 4 tablespoons of white vinegar. 3, 4. This is a lot more acid than I often start with, but I want things to be able to strike where we place them and to get some variation in here, and so I'm very, very excited. But actually, now that I'm thinking about it, when I go ahead and, for example, add our red, which is going to be mostly down here, when I add it, I may not need to add the powder on these other skeins, because by adding it here and working it through, that might move it down. And so we're going to have fun, and we'll see how this all goes. But first, I need to heat things up. We are in this 4-inch deep full-size catering steam pan, and we're over 2 gas burners on my stove. A quick editor's note before I get to the yarn dyeing. While I was working on this, I started to lose my voice. And so instead of talking while I was dyeing, I kept some notes and then filmed a lot more voiceovers. Typically, I like to start with real time before moving into time-lapse with voiceovers, but it can be harder to talk in a mask, in my respirator mask. It's when my voice is weak, and so that's why things are structured this way today. I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves to start dyeing our yarn. I started with our 2 colors that we're going to be all over. The Flamingo Pink, which sort of increases a little bit as we go from one skein to another, and then the Peach Blush, which is a little bit consistent throughout everywhere. I applied the dry dye powder with my gloved fingertips, then wiped my hand on the yarn mop that's off camera, and came in with a spoon to move those colors through. As I'm dyeing this, I know that eventually I might divide up this one pan into 5 different pans, because that just might be a little bit easier to scale up. I went into our Sand Dune and then Vanilla Cream. Both of these colors are more pastel, so they don't, actually all the colors we've used so far are fairly pastel, so they don't have that much pigment per the amount of powder you add. So I found myself wanting to add more and more powder. And then when I did the Vanilla Cream, I worked it through, but then decided to just speckle with it and let that be more speckled. We're gonna have speckles from some of these other colors because of the way that they are gonna strike to the yarn, but I thought it would be particularly fun to have the Vanilla Cream be some speckles. Although that did make me a little hesitant when it came to the Honey Mustard. The Honey Mustard and Vanilla Cream are very, very close to one another. Maybe there's a little bit more orange in the Honey Mustard than there is in the Vanilla Cream, and so I'm torn about keeping both in, but I did, for now, just have the Honey Mustard be speckles before moving into our red. When adding the red, I went back and changed the Honey Mustard to be more splotched, to have that have a little bit of a bigger impact. And I know it's hard to visualize what the colorway is going to look like right now because we see the dark of the yak interspersed, and so that is messing with my brain a little bit. I'm not going to lie. But I think that we are creating something that is really, really fun. And when I flip, I think I'll probably flip the yarn without retwisting it first. I waited 10 minutes before I flipped. And then when I flipped the yarn, this time I started with the red, and I really focused the red the most on I guess what I'm calling skein 5, the one that is more to the bottom of your screen. With the other colors, I tried to carry on, but I kept the mustard spread in the middle 3 skeins, and then the sand and that vanilla cream towards the bottom. I didn't just layer all the colors in the exact same place where I had done it on the first flip, but I tried to, I don't know, do something that I think would look fun together. I hope this will be fun together and that there'll be enough difference between the skeins and they won't be too similar. Oh man. But the nice thing with starting this in one pan is then I'm gonna have separate skeins that I can look at and I can see what works. We can modify from there. I mean, I think that this is gonna be pretty no matter what. It's just the difference might be more subtle compared to when I do this in subsequent times. The important thing is that I love all of these colors together so much. And the reason why I picked these 4 skeins is I wanted to make sure that this is a colorway that would look good on all the different types of fiber blends, and so I picked that range. After I finished the second side, I waited about 10 minutes again before untwisting and retwisting the yarn, adding more color as I felt was needed. I also may have come in with a little bit of water with vinegar at some point. I had a mixture of 8 cups of water with 2 tablespoons of white vinegar off camera, and I added that around the edges just to make sure the water level never got too low. And then once I was satisfied with the amount of coverage I had on our yarn, I heat everything for 30 minutes. Turn off the heat and let things cool so we could wash it. So I think in practicality, this is sort of what I ended up with. The pink and the peach being consistent, but a little bit more pink on the end. A lot of red, the red decreasing through here, and then our other colors sort of as follows. The placement of them isn't what's accurate in here. It's more of the proportion of colors. And so whether or not I continue to dye the next round twisted like I am here, or if I'll do it straight in the pan, that remains to be seen. But I like these vibes that we're getting in here. When washing yarn that I dyed with a direct dye powder application, I like to make sure that I can really submerge the yarn in our water. Because occasionally when you're adding dye, even though you're trying to spread it out, there could be a clump of dye that didn't dissolve. And so having more water here, giving it a soak and agitation, can allow you to see if you get bleeding because there's that excess dye that you need to rinse off. But as I am washing this yarn, this cooled off yarn in cold tap water with a little bit of dish soap, we have no bleeding, and that is wonderful. If you do use removable nylon zip ties like me, do check at the connections. Sometimes dye can get trapped in there. But otherwise, once I was done washing the yarn, I went and I put it through my spin dryer to just spin out a lot of the liquid so it'll be damp instead of dripping, and then I hung it up to finish drying. I did not label the skeins 1 through 5, so hopefully once they're dry, I'll be able to arrange them into sets that make sense. Although that might be the easiest thing to do once I have them twisted up into twisted mini skeins. I think this is our prototype progression. I've divided them up by fiber content, and I think we do have a fairly decent progression. Some of the like skeins 2 and 3 might be a little similar, but I think that we have plans to differentiate them a little bit more once we scale this up. Oh, I can totally tell what order these are supposed to be in. Oh, this is so good. Oh, I'm so happy. Our plan to move forward is a good one. To scale up our colorway, I was going to dye 5 colorways separately, each in their individual pan. Each pan will have 400 grams of yarn that will start with it twisted, 8 cups of water, 4 tablespoons of white vinegar. And to make things easier for myself, when I arranged the dry bundles of yarn off camera, I then zip tied them together. So that way I wouldn't accidentally mess up the proportion, and so we would have unbalanced colorways in the end, because maybe if there was yak, we'd have 2 yaks on color 1 and none on color 2 or something like that. So this worked well for me. One thing I really like about starting in one pan and then dividing it up is that it allows me to edit the colorway a little bit more, see what worked, see how I can make some of the changes between different colorways, either more subtle or more contrasting. And there were a few changes that I made to the plan that I sketched out. One of the things I decided to do was bring some more of those vanilla cream speckles throughout the yarn. I liked that subtle little hint of yellow, and I felt like it tied things together really well. So I brought this more on the first colorway and even onto the fourth, where I really started reducing that honey mustard, was that the yellow, that I included in there. Some other notes that I made along the way was that for the second colorway, it felt like I was adding too much red, so that I only added it to the one side, so that way the red could really increase and grow throughout the next stages. Similarly, to decrease the amount of yellow, on our fourth colorway, I added the yellow just to one side and just to one end of the skein, so that way it wouldn't have as much of an impact. But as I already mentioned, I did bring some of the vanilla cream through there as well. Overall, this time lapse that you're watching right now has over an hour's worth of footage. And that isn't including all the times that I waited in between flipping or waited for the yarn to finish heating for 30 minutes in between. And the reason why I'm bringing up this time is that doing the prototype all in one pan allowed me to, within one batch, work on developing the colorway and then deciding what I liked before going and scaling it up. And I have a feeling it's going to be hard to tell the difference between the prototypes and some of the colorways from the big batch when we go look at the yarn in the end. And so just like I like to give myself some wiggle room when I'm blending colors to see if I might need to change the proportions to get a mix that feels like it's in the center, I can start off with a plan of what I want to achieve, but then as I see how it develops on the yarn itself, then I can really go in and edit and improve this planned fade that I'm creating here. One negative of splitting things up into 5 different pans is that while it would be really easy for me to go heavier on the red in one section than in the other, not just in terms about the number of spots I'm placing it on the yarn, but in one individual location, maybe that red will be darker. In the grand scheme of things, this isn't that big of a deal, but when you have everything in one pan, it's a little easier to maintain the intensity of the colors that you're adding, not just how frequently you're adding them onto the yarn, if that makes sense. Now, as I was working on this, we did create a number of yarn mops that I have not shown you again. I did go ahead and steam set those for 30 minutes off camera, and I'll wash all of this yarn off camera. So we can now move into one more type of dyeing project I want to do with this colorway. Translating this colorway onto sock blanks was really easy because I knew there was sort of a progression of where the colors go, and so I sort of recreated that. In a pan, actually the same pan I used on our prototype, I added 3 sock blanks, a double-stranded stroll, a double-stranded hawthorn blank, and a single-stranded platinum blank. I then heat up the water, and I decided to save the red until last, and I speckled with our vanilla cream, added that sand dune down towards one end. I brought the flamingo pink and peach blush most of the way through the length of the blanks, the honey mustard somewhere in the middle, and then brought the red in where it would be more concentrated down at one end and less down at the other, using the spoon to work through a lot of the colors. We're gonna get some fun variation in the blanks because of how they're scrunched up in the pan, because we're dyeing 300 grams at once, but I'm very excited to see how it turns out. Once I was done adding color, I heat this for 30 minutes, adding more water if needed, if I felt the water level was getting low. And then I turned off the heat, set all of these blanks aside to cool so then I could wash them off camera. Here's a little reminder of what our prototype progression looked like before we go look at our sock blanks, yarn mops, and other skeins that we dyed. Here are the 3 sock blanks that I dyed. And at first, when I washed them, I remember feeling that I didn't have quite as much color as I have on the main skeins. But if I was going to compare this to a set of the prototypes, we're actually pretty spot on. with having a fair amount of whites left in here. I like the way that we end up getting some like speckled variegated coming down through the end, but we get a little bit more and more red as we head towards one side. And I guess the yellow increases and decreases as well. The total amount of the pigment on the three, we've got our single stranded blank, our double knit stroll, and our double knit hawthorn here. The total amount of pigment on each one feels similar, so I think that there might be more white on the single stranded one, at least up on one side. At least that's the way it feels, but there's a little bit more surface area that we have here with the single stranded blank, so it gets scrunched a little bit more in the pan. But if I were to flip one over, you can get a sense of some of the differences that you might have. We will have a lot of speckling here within the blanks themselves, just because of the way that the stitches will unravel. The 4 yarn mops we got from this project have a lot of differences that really depend on how many batches I use them for. These are the 2 yarn mops I used for, I don't think just the sock blanks, I think I also used this on the prototype, but then I used these 2 planks throughout dyeing the 5 separate colorways. And I did steam them at various points in the middle, which meant that we ended up layering more and more dye, and these 2 are a bit more pigmented overall. There's definitely similarities between these yarn mops and the mini skein sets. Here I have one of the prototypes. But the main difference is that the patches of color I think are going to be a little bit smaller on the yarn mop, but there is a lot of overlap. Especially if you were going to consider one of these middle skeins that has all of the colors on it. Sometimes that happens with mops and sometimes it doesn't. And so in the case of something like the SMSMS, where I'm putting sets together, that's a reason why I try to give people yarn mops from a night that's different from the sets that they get, just to mix it up a little bit. Once I started dyeing full skeins, I dyed 20 sets of mini skeins total, or 400 grams of yarn in a pan. And here's one batch. So we have 500 grams of yarn here versus the 2 kilos. And so let's twist these up and compare them to the prototype before we look at all the yarn. Mainly because this is going to help me keep things organized. I'm realizing I may have mixed things up though, because of these, I don't know which one is second and third. Oh, I know how to tell. I think this one goes third because I think I did some brown speckles on it and a little bit less brown. And I think we've got a little bit more red in there. So I think that this actually should go a little bit more like this. That looks a little better. But yeah, those second and third skeins are pretty close. Here's the batch I just showed you twisted up, and here it is next to the prototype round. And okay, I have to say I did a really good job. I think the fact that I dyed the skeins twisted when I moved to the single pans really did help me keep the progression really similar. And I think that having my sketch and then taking notes of like, okay, I'm gonna only do this color on one side, that'll decrease its proportion, also really helped me throughout the process. I don't even know if I showed this with the notes once I was done to compare to our colorway. Right here we have the all-in-one pan. This is the all-in-one pan prototype versus our 5 separate pans colorway on the same yarn base. Both are on Krypton sock, which by the way is so incredibly soft. Oh my goodness, I absolutely adore it. When separating the colorway into 5 pans, I went a little bit lighter on the lightest skein, but also a tad heavier on the heaviest. And I think removing the yellow down here also helped differentiate it a little more from the rest of the yarn. But overall, these colorways feel like the same kind of set, just different batches. And so that's really, really good. And I know that this whole project is more free-flowing than measured compared to the other ones, but by planning how often I'm going to add each of the colors onto each skein, I was able to sort of funnel my artistry in a way to give us a lovely fade set. When filming those conclusions, I didn't even start talking about all the different yarn bases that I've used, because
In a lot of the videos this year, there's up to 10 different blends, but really there are only a couple things that actually feel different. Are that yak base, because it is a darker color to start with, does feel deeper. And then a silk blend does feel a little bit lighter just because of how it absorbs color. But with this particular colorway and there being so much white, the differences between even the Diamond Sock Silk blend, Superwash Merino Silk, and the other Superwash Merino blends is less. Yeah, you can see a list of all the different fiber contents that I've been using during this series right here. Thinking about measuring when you're dyeing yarn is a really interesting concept, because clearly for some recipes you measure out the amount of dye, the volume of liquid, and then you can repeat it. But when it's something more free-flowing like this, I think thinking how many times you're gonna add the dye onto the pan can be helpful. Maybe thinking about things in terms of the number of times you pinch dye out of your container could be helpful as well. But the key to consistency here is not spending a lot of time in between batches. I think if I were gonna go and dye a batch of this today, having just edited the footage, I could create something very, very similar, but you would probably notice a dye lot difference from the original because I don't have the muscle memory from when I dyed this probably two or so months ago. And that muscle memory can be really important when you want to do something that's dyed to order or a reproducible colorway that you create over and over again. Now, the more times you dye something, the better of a feel you'll have and the easier it is to jump back in and try it again. But that is something worth considering if you want to set up your own shop and offer dyed to order listings, which is something that I don't typically do, but there may be some from the series, so keep your eye on the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. I'm not planning to do a dyed to order listing of tonight, but if there is interest in me doing some dyed to order versions of some of the sock blanks I've dyed throughout the series, those I think I could redo in a fairly similar manner. So if that's something that you're interested in, feel free to send me a message in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. I just ask that you try to keep the messages through Etsy to be related to shop stock versus general yarn dyeing conversation. If you're looking for other ways that you can chat with me directly, I do my best to read the comments here on YouTube, and I try to reply to as many questions as I can. I also have a Facebook group, ChemKnits Lab, that I also try to check pretty frequently. My direct messages on social media tend to get fairly clogged, so I'm less likely to see things there these days. So yeah, I would say my Facebook group and YouTube comments are the best ways to reach me, and then Etsy for shop related questions. Now, in addition to some more summer mini skein mini-series sets, and there are still some yarn bases from night 4 left in the Etsy shop. But in addition to those sets, my shop is filled with hand-dyed yarn that's been featured in my videos. And so shopping on Etsy is one of the biggest ways you can help support the content here and help me continue making fun yarn dyeing videos, because I'm having so much fun working on them and I really hope you're enjoying watching them. Stay tuned, because tomorrow night will be night 5 of the 2024 Summer Mini Skein mini-series. Tomorrow will be the last mini skein dyeing night, but after that we're gonna dye a full skein as a special colorway, and then there'll be a behind the scenes vlog where you'll get to see all the packaging and the fun extras and everything I put into this series. I mentioned Etsy, but there are other ways you can support the content here. The biggest thing you can do is subscribe and turn on your notifications. The more you engage with the videos on YouTube, the more likely YouTube is to recommend them to other people. And so that's by far the greatest thing you can do. But you can also join to become a channel member and get some fun badges next to your names or access to the fun ChemKnits emotes. If we get a few more channel members, then I'd have to commission a new emote, but we're close to getting one more. What should that emote be? Leave suggestions down in the comments. And I also have a Patreon. Links to everything are down in the video description. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching.